On the morning of December 6, 1917, Halifax, Nova Scotia woke to a routine winter day. The harbor, the second deepest natural harbor in the world, was busy with wartime traffic, World War I was still raging in Europe, and Halifax was a major hub for military convoys, troop ships, and supply vessels. No one in the city could have imagined that within minutes, their world would be torn apart by one of the most devastating non-nuclear explosions in human history. The events that led to the disaster began with two ships, the Norwegian relief vessel SS Imo and the French cargo ship SS Mont-Blanc. The Mont-Blanc wasn't an ordinary ship. It carried a lethal mix of wartime explosives, about 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and barrels of highly flammable benzol. It was essentially a floating bomb. Because it was packed with explosives, the Mont-Blanc traveled slowly and cautiously, flying the red hazard flags that warned other ships to stay clear. Meanwhile, the Imo was behind schedule. It had been delayed leaving its anchorage the previous day and was desperate to make up time. As it moved into the harbor that morning, the Imo increased its speed and steered into the narrow channel known as the Narrows, just as the Mont-Blanc was entering the harbor from the opposite direction. What happened next was a tragic chain of miscommunication and poor timing. Both ships signaled intentions that the other misread. Both attempted last-minute maneuvers to avoid collision, and in the final seconds, both captains realized the inevitable. The ships were heading straight for each other. At 8:45 a.m., the Imo struck the Mont-Blanc near its bow, scraping open barrels of benzol and igniting sparks. The liquid benzol spilled across the deck, quickly catching fire. The crew of the Mont-Blanc knew exactly what was about to happen. They were sitting on a time bomb, one that could detonate with unimaginable force. Panicked, they abandoned ship and rowed frantically to shore, warning no one. But their warnings wouldn't have mattered anyway. Most people along the shoreline saw only a burning ship drifting toward the pier. Crowds gathered, children ran to the windows, workers paused to watch, and firefighters rushed toward the scene. Across Halifax and neighboring Dartmouth, hundreds of people were fixated on the flames. At 9:04 a.m., the Mont-Blanc erupted in a massive explosion. The ship vanished in a blinding white flash. The blast released the energy of roughly 3 kilotons of TNT, about 1/5 the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A shockwave tore outward at over 1,000 meters per second, flattening buildings, shattering windows miles away, and throwing people through the air. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out in an instant. The explosion created a massive fireball, followed by a mushroom-shaped cloud that climbed thousands of feet into the air. Everything within a half-mile radius was obliterated. Wooden homes were reduced to splinters, brick buildings collapsed, and rail cars flew like toys. In some places, only foundations remained. One of the most haunting aspects of the disaster was the human cost of shattered glass. Thousands of residents had gathered at their windows to watch the fire moments before the blast. When the shockwave hit, the glass turned into knives. Many victims suffered horrific facial injuries, and hundreds were permanently blinded. In the Richmond district, directly across from the explosion, the devastation was absolute. A bustling neighborhood of workers, families, schools, and shops was almost entirely erased. The ground shook so violently that people miles away believed it was an earthquake. Then came the tsunami. The blast displaced an enormous volume of water, sending a wave surging inland. It swept people, buildings, and debris with it, drowning those who had survived the initial explosion but were trapped near the shoreline. The wave carried the Imo, still afloat, before breaching it far upriver. Within minutes, Halifax resembled a battlefield. Fires broke out across the city, entire streets were blocked by debris, and hospitals overflowed instantly. Many of the city's doctors and nurses had been injured or killed, leaving survivors to improvise emergency care wherever they could. The death toll was staggering. Nearly 2,000 people were killed, either instantly or in the hours following the explosion. More than 9,000 were injured, many severely, and over 25,000 people were left homeless in the middle of winter. But as devastating as the explosion was, the response revealed something remarkable. Help began arriving within hours. The neighboring city of Boston sent an entire relief train, doctors, nurses, supplies, and volunteers. It traveled through a blizzard to reach Halifax, becoming a symbol of international compassion that the cities still commemorate today. Clearing the debris took months. Rebuilding the city took years, but the impact of the explosion lasted far longer. It reshaped Halifax's urban landscape, changed international shipping regulations, and became a case study in emergency response and industrial safety. The Halifax explosion remains the largest human-made explosion before the atomic age. It was a tragedy born of miscommunication, wartime pressures, and sheer bad luck, but also a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming destruction. More than a century later, the scars of the explosion are still part of Halifax's history, but so is the memory of how its people rebuilt, healed, and carried on after one of the most devastating disasters ever to strike a North American city. Thank you everybody for watching the video. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate the support.